Okay, good morning. It's a pleasure today to end our SIDA course, Scholarly Editing and Digital Approach course, because this is our last last class for our class, to have here Dirk Van Hulle and to have his really big project related to Beckett digital manuscript projects. I introduce Van Hulle. You have already heard his name in this class, but just to say he's professor of bibliography and modern book history at the University of Oxford at the moment. He was previously at the University of Antwerp, where he is the director of the Center of Manuscript Genetic at the University of Antwerp. He's co-director with Mark Nixon of the Beckett Digital Manuscript Project. This is the project we will introduce and talk about today. Series editor of the Cambridge UP series Elements in Beckett Studies. And he is also editor-in-chief of the Journal of Beckett Studies. If you want something related to Beckett, you have to ask him, because there is no one who better may introduce you and explain everything related to Beckett. You have made a lot of stuff related to Beckett. He will tell us when began his love with Beckett, Samuel Beckett. He wrote many books: Textual Awareness, 2004, Modern Manuscripts. This is really interesting for our study of variants, Modern Manuscript, 2014. And the New Cambridge Companion to Samuel Beckett, 2015. And James Joyce, Work in Progress, 2016. And the Beckett Digital Library and a series of volumes of Making of Series. I would like to know something more about this series. I think it may be really interesting also for some Italian writer, probably. Genetic edition of a Beckett digital manuscript project. This project won in 2019, so this year won the big prize for a bibliography archive or digital project of MLA, Modern Language Association. It's a very important prize, so it's a pleasure to have here Dirk Van Hulle, and I thank him for having been here and for his lecture. Thank you very much, Dirk. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paola and Francesca, for the invitation to come and speak to you today. What I would like to do, if that's okay with you, is to start with a short theoretical introduction. Then I will zoom in on the project itself, and then, if we have time, zoom out again a little bit to come to some conclusions, yeah? And to think about what digital edition is useful for. So, to begin with, I'm going to reflect on the notion of a complete works edition in a digital environment. The printed medium has had a significant impact on the conceptualization of the complete works edition. It has prompted editors to present authors' complete works as a sort of holy grail, an editorial vessel that captures each word of the author as if it were a drop of divine blood or something, purged from any kind of textual impurity or corruption. This purity discourse marks, for instance, the influential Greg Bowers tradition, the American tradition of textual editing. Here, this is Fritz and Bowers. The recovery of the initial purity of an author's text and of any revision, and the preservation of this purity despite the usual corrupting process of reprint transmission, is the aim of textual criticism. So you see that this purity is really part of the discourse. It has been criticized in literary theory, this purity discourse, but it has proven to be very difficult to find alternatives in practice, in editorial practice. So I therefore propose a shift from this Grail model, which is conditioned by the print medium, to a quest paradigm. So instead of the Grail, we're looking for to present the work as a quest, both from the writer's perspective and the reader's perspective. So from the writer's perspective, writing is a constant search for the right words in the right form to convey a message. From a reader's perspective, an interest in the author's complete works goes beyond the engrossment in a particular text and implies an interest in the often complex development of the oeuvre as a whole. And that in itself is also a quest. So if a complete works edition really aims to be complete, it should present the entirety of this quest, not just the polished end result of the published works. The complete works edition has always been an instrument in processes of canonization. And then I mean two kinds of canonization. First of all, the canon as the thing in which an author can have a place as one of the great authors of all time. And in second instance, each author's own canon. So, and I'm zooming in on this second form of complete works. In Beckett's case, for instance, here you have a book called A Beckett Canon, which tells us what the Beckett canon is. It's interesting that she calls it a Beckett canon, because she's aware that it can change, which is interesting. One of the things that is very interesting is that she actually includes things that have not been published in Beckett's lifetime. So things from the archives, which is interesting. We, in the meantime, by working on this project, have discovered new works that have not been published. So our question is, should they be included in a complete works edition? Or to put it differently, how complete is a complete works edition without them? Yeah? You can ask the question that way as well. So what I'm going to try and do later today is present a teleological approach to editing, which is focused on the published works, and a non-teleological or dysteleological approach, which also includes the things that never made it into publication. Then we have the works. So first we ask a question about completeness, then what are works? For complete works, print apparently still serves as the medium of choice. A few recent examples in the modernist period are critical or historical critical editions of the complete works of Paul Celan, Joseph Conrad, Catherine Mansfield, Marcel Proust, Arthur Schnitzler, Virginia Woolf, etc., etc. And then we have digital editions. And there we can make a distinction between works that usually focus on a more limited amount of works. Just one, for instance, the Faust project, the Faust edition, or just a few works, the Jane Austen manuscripts, which you have seen, I believe. And then the more comprehensive enterprises usually present themselves not as editions, but as archives. Yeah? You have the Rossetti archive, the Walt Whitman archive, etc., etc. So, while most digital editions privilege a teleological approach and have a limited scope, the archive model is usually quite complete, but it offers few connections between the documents. And those connections, I believe, that is the key to what is thinking about what is an edition. If you ask me what's the difference between an archive and an edition, I would say the connections. I mean, I can put all the manuscripts of Beckett online, but if I don't present any connections, I don't think it's an edition. It's just an archive. So, what is an edition? In the printed medium, usually you had this, a set of works. That's how it was presented. And this was really conditioned by the print medium, because you can't present everything in one big volume. It's impossible. So usually, out of pragmatic purposes, or for pragmatic purposes, people divide them into different novels with an apparatus at the back. And then, of course, it's the editor's job to present this as some kind of gestalt, something that belongs together. And in an introduction, for instance, he or she writes about how these things interconnect, and you get the sense of an oeuvre. Yeah? So, in that way, he or she presents the oeuvre as something that is more than just the parts. Yeah? Now, so it's a sort of gestalt, you could say. But a gestalt is not only greater than, but also different from the sum of its parts. Yeah? So not just more than the sum of its parts, but also different from. As Carol Pratt writes in the introduction to Wolfgang Köhler's The Task of Gestalt Psychology, it is a common error, she writes, to leave out the word different and simply define a gestalt as the whole is more than the sum of its parts. This definition mistakenly ignores that a relationship between the parts is itself something that is not present in the individual parts themselves. For instance, if all the parts of a bike are laid out on the floor of a bike shop, they still do not make up the bike. Yeah? So it's really important to realize that it's the connections that turn it into this. Yeah? Okay, I know it's a simple example, but that's the gist of the argument. So it's not, unfortunately, no. Yeah, I wish. So, what can a digital complete works edition be expected to effectuate or bring about? It can present the writer's oeuvre as a web of inter- and intra-textual relations, and thus open up new avenues for interpretation. It can make us rethink the role of the editor, from being the author's high priest who guards the grail, so to speak, in the form of the definitive single text, to becoming a maker of connections, providing readers with tools to navigate the complete works. And it can enable the macro-analysis of authors' complete oeuvres across versions. And macro-analysis, I don't know whether you're familiar with this term. It's suggested by Matthew Jockers. He calls distant reading, for instance, macro-analysis. But as you know, distant reading usually uses just one version of a text, not even a correct version in many cases. What we do is we provide different versions of text. So you could actually create, in hopefully 10 years' time, do something like macro-analysis across versions. Now, to accomplish this, we need to start from a change of mindset, I think. A different way of conceiving of a writer's complete works. The difference between the Grail paradigm and the Quest paradigm is fundamental. And it goes to the heart of a key question. Key question is, what is a work of art? If we treat the oeuvre as a gestalt, this raises the question whether the work of art is a clear-cut figure, like this finished product, like this vase, or a grail, if you want, or rather the dialectics between the figure and the ground. You probably all know this famous picture by Edgar Rubin, yeah? So the notion of a gestalt consists of the figure and the ground, and you have to decide for yourself what's the figure and what is the ground, yeah? So I think even if you consider the wide shape still to be the work, it also indicates that there is a ground that suggests this. Yeah? Many authors are aware of this, and they present all of this material to archives, university archives, and so in a way, it is our job, I think, to include that as well, and indicate that that is to him or her, to the author, the work. I'll give you another example. This comes from the city of Ghent in my country, Belgium. It's a painting, a fresco, on a wall in the city of Ghent. It was donated to the city in 2016. And as you can see, it's called The Virgin. It's a girl. And on the right-hand side, you also see some brush strokes. It looks like, I don't know what it looks like to you. It's what does it look like to you? It's more or less like he's testing out the colors or the thickness of the brush or something like that. Yeah. But it's part of the fresco. So it's a huge fresco in the middle of the city center, and that is part of it. Until 2017, when a community worker cleaned the wall and thought, well, this is ugly, we'll clean it up. So this is now the work of art. So it raised a whole controversy because the artist said, damn you, I gave you a picture and you destroyed it because this was part of the picture, you know? So what is the work of art? Is it this or the previous one? Clearly, to the artist, it included all the brushstrokes. To the community worker, clearly not. So it's up to, I mean, you can't decide. It's up to, I mean, whatever you think it is. Yeah? Anyway, from the author's perspective, at least, there was this inclusive idea of the work. And I think we should, as editors, try and at least give the opportunity to people. Now, nobody knows about this. As editors, we can at least show that there was this opportunity to think of the work that way. Anyway, so far for a very general introduction. So, from an editorial theory perspective, you have different traditions, and I'm sure you're familiar with many of them. Since I'm dealing with Samuel Beckett, who is a bilingual author, he wrote in English and in French, I have to deal basically with two traditions, the English and the French. And I'll start very briefly with the American or the English tradition, where you have this tradition of the copy text theory. So they work with one copy text, and you can basically, as an editor, take words from other texts, other versions, if you think they fit better, basically. I'm turning this into a caricature, I know, but anyway, for the sake of the argument. And you have Greg, then Bowers, etc. But they have a few assumptions. And one of the assumptions is the one I already mentioned, that notion of purity, which is debatable. And then this was criticized in 1975, famously by a German or Swiss critic, Hans Ziller. And I'll just zoom in very briefly on A and B. So first of all, this notion of purity goes back to the notion of the stemma, because the stemma goes back to the notion of family trees. And when were family trees important, especially with dynasties, royal dynasties, for instance? So the purity of the bloodline was very important. So we have to realize that this is a metaphor, and that metaphors have dangerous connotations sometimes. Yeah? So do we want to continue to use the idea of a stemma, for instance? And this is the criticism. Actually, the criticism is also tainted by this, shouldn't be using, I'm using the same metaphor here, but is also characterized by the same metaphor of purity, but from the other perspective. He says, actually, if you take a copy text and you integrate words from other versions, you're contaminating the text, so to speak. You can't do that. So both camps actually think in terms of that notion of purity. So then, of course, things developed, and from the copy text, we went to textual pluralism, Jack Stillinger, to the fluid text theory by John Bryant, which comes very close, actually, to the French critique génétique, or genetic criticism. And as a result, the MLA, which was already mentioned earlier on, which has a committee on scholarly editions, they define not just copy text, but in the meantime they changed the glossary, and they included also a base text. So you don't have to use copy text, you can also use a base text, and I'll come back to that in a minute, because we, for the Beckett project, use a base text rather than a copy text. So we went from schools of scholarly editing to what we call orientations to text. And I wrote an article together with Peter Schillingsberg to turn this into this model into something new, which is not defined in terms of camps, you know, the German camp versus the English camp or whatever, but it defines orientations to text. And you're completely free, whatever orientation you choose. The trick is simply to make explicit in advance what your orientation is. Yeah? To tell openly, okay, I am interested in the author's intention, so my approach will be guided by authorial intention. Yeah? Or my approach is very genetic. I'm interested in the writing process, so that's why my edition is different from another person's. Yeah? So that's what we did in 2015. And this also indicates that all these schools are coming together, so to speak. There's a rapprochement between them. I mean, I used to remember these clashes between the Germans and the English. That doesn't happen anymore because, to a large extent, thanks to the digital medium. Yeah? We all think digitally now in one language, the digital language. So what is a digital scholarly edition? I don't have to tell you, but it's certainly not a digitized complete works edition, for instance. It is something that is conceived from a digital paradigm, as Patrick Zahler defines. What is this paradigm? Well, it enables and facilitates accessibility, searchability, usability, and computability. So if I return to this survey, I'm zooming in now on the genetic, and that brings me to the second part of my talk, the Beckett Digital Manuscript Project. So, are there any questions so far? Everything clear? Okay. Yeah. 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 Perfect. Then we go on. So, what I'm going to show you is a digital genetic edition, which is of course inspired by French genetic criticism. And genetic criticism, to define it very briefly, I'm using Pierre-Marc de Biasy, Towards the Science of Literature, and there's a paragraph where he sort of defines genetic criticism rather concisely. He says you have genetic and you have criticism. So the first part, genetic, is actually the more technical part. It tries to render technically readable and analyzable the before the text, the avant text. Yeah? So basically, when you're dealing with manuscripts, it's tough to read. So it's your first job, basically, as an editor, is to make sure that other people will be able to read it. Yeah? So that's one part of it. And then you have to construct the logic of the genesis. Usually that means put the manuscripts in a chronological order. Yeah? And then there's the criticism part, which is I'm not going into that in detail now, but it means that you have to look at these things and analyze them from a particular perspective. It's an illusion to think that you can do without. Everyone has his own perspective. Everyone is biased. Everyone has sort of glasses that are colored. Your look at things is different. My look is different from Paola's look at things, I'm sure, I think. So the trick is, again, to be open about it, to say, look, I'm interested in sociology. I'm looking at these manuscripts from a sociological perspective. I want to know how this author worked together with other people and was influenced or inspired by other groups of people. So that is roughly what genetic criticism stands for. So I'm going to briefly zoom in on criticism in order to zoom in on genetic in a minute. So the criticism part of our project is actually in book form. So you could say that our project is hybrid. Usually hybrid editions are meant to have the texts on paper and the comments online. In our case, it's the other way around, because we want to give also young scholars the opportunity to write a monograph. Basically, for every module or volume that we create, we have a volume that gives a kind of the story of the genesis, the making of a particular work. And this one came out this week, actually. This is the number 8 in the series. So it's about a play called Play and a film called Film by Samuel Beckett. And Olga Beloborodova has written the critical analysis. So we have 8 of them, and the big works are in them: Waiting for Godot, Endgame, Krapp's Last Tape, etc. So we can talk about the content of those volumes later on, but I think it's probably best that we zoom in on the digital part of things, the genetic in this case. So to come back to that notion of what is the genetic part, Pierre-Marc de Biasy divides this into 5 subcategories, so to speak. So what you need to do, you need to constitute a genetic dossier. Where are the manuscripts? In Beckett's case, sometimes they are dispersed over 12 different archives across the Atlantic. You have to organize the documents, and this first organization is teleological. It means, okay, you have all these manuscripts. Sometimes they are absolutely not in the right order. You have to figure out first, okay, suppose you're dealing with a novel of 200 pages and 20 chapters. Okay, this part is chapter 3, this part is chapter 5, etc. So teleological. Yeah? You look at the end product. Then you have to classify the rough drafts, because all these things are in different archives, so in different catalogs. The catalog numbers do not connect to each other. You have to create a new numbering system. Yeah? So usually they use an x-axis and a y-axis for that. The x-axis indicates the narrative sequence, the 20 chapters of the novel, and the y-axis is the temporal sequence of the different versions. Then, very importantly, you have to decipher and transcribe. The distinction is simply, if you decipher, it means simply that you look at the text and you try to figure out for yourself what it says. Transcription means that you do this for someone else. This someone else can be yourself, your later self, for instance. You went to an archive, and later on you want to know what you saw. You want to do this as precise as possible. Yeah? So that's the job. And then finally, publish it, because we're dealing with unpublished material. If you want to write about this, there is no way to communicate about it unless you publish it. Yeah? So how do you do that? So let's zoom in on the first 3, from a genetic dossier to a genetic map, as I'll call it. I'm calling this a genetic map because you recognize that stemma. So that notion of purity. Of course, when we're dealing with drafts, we're dealing with anything but purity. It's dirty. It's the dirtiest drafts actually that we are most interested in, because that's where the writing goes on. Yeah. In many cases, for instance, Thomas Mann, writers destroy this early stage because, you know, they're a bit reticent to give this to the world. Well, it's their full right. But if people don't do that, then it's also a poetical statement. Beckett not just did not destroy them, he actively gave them to a university archive. So again, that's part of his poetics. And that's why we choose to talk about a map. Yeah, we try to map this out. It's a different metaphor, you could say. So this is the map for fin de partie, end game. And if I zoom in, you'll see that we make a distinction between documents and versions, because there is a distinction. It's different. A document can contain several versions, as in the beginning, or two documents can make up one version. As you can see here, for instance, on the left-hand side, you see the first act of Endgame, which is in Ohio, in the United States, and the second act is in Ireland. They just ended up in two different archives, but they belong together. They were written more or less together, so we treat them as one version. Yeah? So that's the difference between documents and versions. Then we move on to deciphering and transcribing. I'll first explain how we proceed in the BDMP, and then I'll show you online. Sorry. Good. Very good. You don't need to understand XML or anything. It's just if you know more or less what it's about, that's fine. So we have topographic transcriptions. We have linear transcriptions, for which we use XML, extensible markup language. And we have something in between. I'll show you in a minute. Then we have, in order to look at these things, you can do things with them. That's why we transcribe them in XML, because you can turn this text into something much more flexible by doing it. For instance, you can indicate where something was added. So you have a linear transcription with an addition, but you can indicate, okay, this was added in the left margin, for instance. Or you can indicate the colors of the writing tools. You can also indicate if people don't want to read the cancellations, because it's a bit cumbersome to read, you can remove them and only give them the top layer. Yeah? And then, of course, you can also show people the encoding underneath, the XML encoding. We use the TEI guidelines for the XML, which stands for the Text Encoding Initiative. For those of you who are not familiar with XML, it's simply a markup language that indicates very explicitly for each addition or deletion that it is an addition or a deletion. Yeah? It does not simply cross it out. It says it's a deletion, and it puts it between tags. But because the guidelines are, well, they are very useful, but they are huge. There are many, many, many suggested tags, and we only need a few, so we made our selection. And it may be useful for you to have a look at our selection if you're interested in making your own project, because It saves you a lot of time. Yeah. I mean, if you print it out, yes. Yeah. Elements, yeah. 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 So, to just indicate what I mean with a linear transcription, here you see something that is written on the left-hand page, and we turn it into this. Yeah, it's more or less linear because Beckett, in this case, was writing prose. So we try to give a text that can be written as prose. This is a topographic transcription of Virginia Woolf's project, To the Lighthouse. And I'll zoom in and tell you why actually we decided not to take this approach. Here you have a text, and as you can see, I don't know whether you know that this project, or is it, it's not big enough, yes. You see, it's very interesting because above each line you have the transcription, and there is a slider in which you can remove the written text and or the other, yeah? So you make that decision. So it's very useful. So you can make disappear the manuscript. But if you look at the manuscript and look at what they did with it, you see that there is a line that starts with ruminated, that problem, which of poverty, etc. And that was turned into the, yeah? The is written above. We, as human beings, recognize this immediately. But because they worked with lines, because it's topographic, so they see this as an image rather than a text, and the image consists of lines. Each line is defined, but that also means that the line with the is a separate line. And that's why these two are separated from each other, you know? Yeah? And you can recognize this in here they also have a system to look at they don't use XML, but it's a similar system, and you see why this effect is created, yeah? It's separated because of these lines. This is another example, the Shelley Godwin, yeah? And these are the Frankenstein manuscripts. And again, you can see the XML underneath. And what they did to make this transcription is they work with lines again, yeah? So everything is seen as an image, line per line per line. We don't do that. We have a textual approach, so not a documentary, but a textual approach. Because, for instance, here, this is the first line of the unnameable. Where now, who now, when now, and he makes a mistake. Now it shouldn't be a KN, but just NOW. But you see that it's 3 sentences on one line. So instead of treating it as one line, we treat it as 3 sentences. It's more precise in this case. So this is what the XML would look like. You have a seg for a segment, like a sentence, and then a number of the manuscript, and then a sentence number. Okay. I'll try to explain what we do with the sentence numbers. So this is what you see in the edition. What I showed you a minute ago was the English version, which said where now, who now, when now. In the French, it's actually, the order is different, which is already interesting. But this is an early version. So here, he doesn't have 3 questions, but 2 questions, yeah? Où maintenant, qui maintenant? It says compare sentence. If you click on that, a sentence number appears in front of every sentence. So we have ou maintenant is the first sentence, qui maintenant is the third sentence. This is because it's not the second sentence, because this is an early version and the second sentence is not yet present. It came in later. Yeah? Now, this sentence numbering is actually very simple. It's a very simple idea, but it is rather powerful for the navigation. Because of course, the biggest danger of this big project is that you get lost in the huge amount or huge number of manuscripts. Yeah? So if you click on one of these sentence numbers, let's say number 3, you get this, a survey of all the versions of that particular sentence in all the different versions. So we, as I said, we as editors make connections. That's what we offer. Yeah? Otherwise, you have to look for all these documents yourself, and we bring them together at the sentence level. So how does this sentence numbering work in the BDMP? First, we choose a base text. And that's why I gave you that introduction about copy text and base text. We don't use it as a copy text. We use it as a base text, simply as an anchor, basically, an anchor. Usually we use the first edition of the original language because it's Beckett, so we use the French in this case because it was written in French first. And then we simply we take that first sentence, that first edition, and we read sentence by sentence and number them. Sentence by sentence by sentence. It's very boring, but it's very useful in the end. So that numbering serves for everything. For drama text, the speaker is not a sentence in our system, but anyway. Then we use the seg tag to indicate that it's a sentence, yeah? And we connect the sentence from the base text to a sentence that we find in, say, the first manuscript. And that is a 0001 for the first sentence, yeah? And one night as he sat is the first sentence. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah, wherever we find the sentence one night as he sat, or a variant, or another version of it, we give it that number. Of course, I do have to tell that other writers write differently, so it might not work for other authors. In Beckett's case, whenever he has a sentence, he usually sticks to it, or whenever he has a rough draft, he usually keeps the same structure. Virginia Woolf, for instance, doesn't work like that. When she has the first draft, she writes a second draft, and it's the same, roughly the same idea, but the sentences are completely different. So you might want to come up with another system for that. So once you've numbered them, there are, of course, special cases, as you can imagine. First special case, one sentence in the base text is spread over 2 sentences in a document. He came over and he drank some tea. In the early document, it was actually 2 sentences. He came over, he drank some tea. Okay, this is a fake example, but you see what I mean, right? In that case, we take them together because the sentence number is 7 in the base text. The base text rules, yeah? Yeah. Same as the opposite. He came over is sentence 7 in the base text, and sentence 8 is he drank some tea. And in the early version, it's he came over and drank some tea. Then we split them up. Yeah? This is the advantage of XML. It's in the cellars. You don't see anything in your exhibition, so to speak. So you don't see anything of what you do here. And then the most difficult aspect is when you have a sentence in an early version that does not get or make it into the final version. So here, this is sentence 7. is followed by this is an extra sentence, and then is followed by this is sentence 8, then we have to find a mechanism to indicate where that belongs. So we connect it to the previous sentence, 7, and then start a second numbering. See? 007 slash 001. Yeah? And exactly. And as soon as you arrive at the next sentence, you use 8 again. Yeah? So that's how it works. And that is also why you see that when we clicked on sentence number 3 before, you see that there's a few things that are added in bold. And that's the things that have that extra numbering. So in this case, that's 003 slash 001 and slash 002. They belong to it because we have no other place to put it. Yeah? That's the way we visualized it. Yeah? Okay. So then we come to the last aspect, publishing. That brings us to the Beckett archive. And I'll just if that's okay. If you want to, yes, of course. Yeah, very good. So it's www.beckettarchive.org. Yeah. 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 Let's say that 90% of what I'm going to talk about is online. The extra 10% is you get extra. We're working on that, so you won't be able to see that. But anyway. So if you say you're interested in a particular work, okay, that's one of the things that you don't see. You have less of these works. We are working on many more, as you see. But let's say fin de partie is on your screens as well. We click on fin de partie, then you have a catalog first. We start with a catalog. We thought that's actually a very important choice if you start a project. What is the first thing you present? But we think this is quite neutral. You go to an archive and you find materials. The second thing under about is the chronology. You see that? Chronology. If you chronology, yeah? And this is where we introduce the genetic map. So here you see exactly the same map that I showed you earlier, yeah? With the documents and the versions, yeah? And here, let's click on FT2, for instance, for the sake of the exercise. And the first thing you see is thumbnails. Let's click on the first one. You have this document. It's been torn apart at some point, but stitched together again. You see many colors, many revision campaigns. You can zoom if you click on this. You can have the image text approach that I mentioned. So that's, yeah. Or you can have the text approach, simply the plain text. If you click on that, you see that there is an item that says tools. The tools give you the default transcription, as you can see here, with every deletion crossed out and every addition in superscript. But you can also click on this here, place indications, and then it indicates where something was added. Yeah, something was added in the margin or whatever. Or you can click on writing tools, and then you see that it indicates the color of the pen in which something was added. Yeah? Or, so here you can click on top layer, for instance, and then you don't get the deletions. You don't see the things that are crossed out, simply to make it easier for people to read. And you can also click on the XML encoding if you're interested in the encoding. So that's also a way of, I think it's a good principle to show people, it's a matter of transparency. Everyone can check us and correct us, hopefully. Yeah. Okay, then let's go to another one. So back to Samuel Beckett Digital Manuscript Project. We choose l'innommable, the unnameable. And here we have, sorry, I clicked on, I'll go back on this one, this thumbnail, 1, 2, 3, 4. And here you see où maintenant, qui maintenant. These are the sentences that we saw earlier. If you click on image text, here, you see that compare sentences appears. You click on compare sentences, and here, for instance, number 3, that's what I showed you, yeah? So instantly, wherever you are, you get a synoptic survey of all the versions of that particular sentence. So that's pretty powerful, I think. And of course, this forces you to still compare the sentences. This one is very short, but suppose it's a very long sentence. You don't want to do all the comparison yourself. We integrated an automatic collation tool called collatex. So here for the French, you can click on this, and you get all the French versions underneath each other. They are collated instantly. Or for the English, the same thing. Yeah? Okay, here there's no variants, but here there are. So whenever there's a variant, it indicates the variant. Here, for instance, there is a small variant, and it indicates immediately where that is. And it does so on the fly. It's an enormously powerful tool. It's not perfect yet. So that's why we're a little bit hesitant to integrate it, but we think people are intelligent enough to figure out where it doesn't work perfectly yet. So that's why we think it's important and useful to offer it. But all of this is very textual. It's to most people who are not into digital editing or not into editing at all, this is the more boring part. Although I think it's, from a textual point of view and from an editorial point of view, it's the most powerful, I think. But you can also look at manuscripts as images or as documents. All of this is very teleological. This is again the starting page. We started here with genetic editions. So you start basically with the telos, with the finished product. We recently changed this, and we added, for instance, notebooks, simply because people may be interested in a notebook. For instance, let's take this one. I don't know whether this is going to work on all of your computers, because it works with Flash, Adobe Flash, and it always does this with mine. So, but anyway, if you are just interested in the book as an object, it's not a physical object, but it sort of creates a virtual experience of the object, you get this, yeah? And if you click on the image, yeah, I think it's for the book, yes, yeah. It's freely available if you want to integrate. So one of the things you can do is, here we made a topographic transcription. Well, it's not really necessary, but because it clearly works very linearly. But one of the things you can do with it then is create this. Yeah, you can zoom the topographic transcription. It's sometimes useful. If we go back to notebooks, you have this one, for instance. Again, this is the same notebook that we saw a minute ago, but from another perspective. Here, just presented as a physical object. If we take the second notebook of L'Innommable, and you just scroll through it to the end of all the thumbnails, you see that he wrote this manuscript until the very end of the notebook. I need to go to the previous page. This is not just the last page, but as you can see, it's not ruled. So it's the flyleaf even of the last page. And that's where he writes fin. This is his first manuscript. Now, it's impossible, I think, to write a novel of 200 pages and end your novel, your manuscript, on the end of the notebook. So I don't know if you've read the story, but there's clearly something in the poetics of Samuel Beckett that just presents this as an outpour, and it's just like, I can't stop. Well, just tell me where to stop. Okay, this is the end of the notebook. Okay, I'll stop here. That's what he does. So it's poetically inspired. So this actual physical document is really important, and it is important to present it that way as well, not just as a textual product, but also as a physical product. And then this is one that is not among the notebooks that you can see, I think. This is a very recent one, but it's called the Horoscope Notebook. And say you're interested just in the notes in this notebook, and you see this, Bacon, De nobis ipsis silemus, taken by Kant as the epigraph to Kritik der reinen Vernunft. You see, okay, but apparently he took an interest in Kant. Let's have a look at his personal library, because that's the next thing you can see in the edition, Beckett Digital Library. You click on it, under K, you might find Kant, and indeed, you do find Kant. He had the complete works by Kant. And in the introduction, you see that on page 5, there's, okay, admittedly, it's not spectacular. It's just a line in the right margin, but it's exactly the line that we were looking for. So you see there's connections everywhere, not just in the margins, but even in his notes. He is interested in this line that says that Kant took the line De nobis ipsis silemus, we don't speak about ourselves, is taken from Bacon by Kant to use it as the motto of the Kritik der reinen Vernunft. And then you have, and that's what I mentioned earlier about connections, we make a connection with the manuscripts, because if you click on this here, manuscript link, you see that De nobis ipsis silemus is here at the back of that same notebook that we saw. And there's a note that says that he refers to Bacon, but it's actually taken from Kant. And there is also a reference to the page in this very manuscript, page 44 verso. You click on it, and you see that Beckett used this sentence in the text of L'Innommable itself. It says, De nobis ipsis silemus, decidedly that should have been my motto, he says. Which is, of course, completely ironic, because he can't stop talking about himself. And then, of course, if you click on L, you can go back to the library, and you're full circle. So what we try to do here is try to make circles, make these loops between the library and the texts themselves, to see how he used external source texts. Then, in the library, you have an option that says Student Library, here on the right. And that student library, as you can see here, starts with Bacon, Francis Bacon. We've just met him. And the second one is an Italian Bible, a Sacra Bibbia, because Beckett studied Italian at Trinity College in Dublin. So these two are books that we still have and that were in his possession when he was studying in Trinity College. If you click on this here, include books from the virtual library, you see that under B, we start with Bacon again. But before we reach the second one, the Italian Bible, we have to plow through many works by Balzac, mainly Balzac, and then Bergson, and then finally the Bible. So he read many, many more books than we still possess. And of course, that's the fate of many authors' libraries. If we're lucky to still possess them, they're full of lacunae, full of gaps. Books that we know that he must have read because we have his notes or his letters where he mentions them, but we don't have them anymore. So we try to virtually reconstruct them. That's the virtual library. Okay. Then finally, I'm just going to. You can search for words. It's silly, but in the meantime, it's silly. But I mean, 15 years ago, we couldn't do that with any edition. So there it is. It's useful. It's very useful because it searches through everything, not just the final text. It even searches through the marginalia in his books. But it can also do other things. We have here some suggested searches, intertextual references and all kinds of things. And one of them is doodles. So if you click on Go for doodles, it shows you all the doodles and that we can find. But of course, it's very difficult to search for doodles. So we have some categories. And say you're interested in a zoomorph character, you search, and you find all the zoomorph characters that are really doodles. Usually the doodles are, there's no connection or not an apparent connection with the text. It's just something sort of writer's block, short writer's block that he says. Well, I don't have any inspiration, but it's also a way of keeping the pen on the page, you know? It seems to be important as a creative act. So if you click on this, you go to the doodle in its original context, and if you click on double page view, you get the whole context, because we think it's important to have the double page, because the two pages can talk to each other, are always in a dialogue with each other. And then perhaps finally some free features that you may have already discovered. This is the writing sequence of L'Innommable. As you can see here, these are all the sentences and the sentence numbers. You can do that very easily because you've numbered them. As you can see, you can do all kinds of things once you have done the boring work, you know. So if you click on animate, you see that you can present them in the order that they were written. And as you can see, it's not as it is in the final text. Here you see, for instance, at some point, yes, here. See this one? We can reconstruct very precisely when he wrote the ending. And the ending came rather early. So that's also poetically an interesting given that you can reconstruct. Yeah? You can do some other statistics. Let's turn to this one here. So if you go to free features statistics, you see this here. This is actually very easy again, based on the XML. Every sentence indicates how many deletions there are, how many additions there are, so you can do statistics on them and indicate how hard he worked on a particular work, etc. You can also indicate how what the ratio is between deleted and added words. For Joyce, for instance, this would look completely different. So you can do that work by work, but you can do it also for the full genetic dossier, for all the versions. Oh, sorry, it doesn't work here. No, I'll have to report that. But as you can see, for Joyce it would be very few deletions, many additions. His work kept growing. In Beckett's case, it's the other way around. He kept taking away, slimmer and slimmer and slimmer. Yeah? That sort of confirms what we already knew, but of course we can nuance that. And when you zoom in, you can see, aha, but that's not always the case. That's the way he presented it. That's the way he wanted to present his work as well. So sometimes it does grow. So that the nuances can be visualized in this way. And the last thing I want to show is here. Wherever you are, you can click on this, your comments. And you don't need to indicate, I am on page such and such, on line such and such. It knows it immediately because you are there. And you just type something. You don't even have to indicate your name. It's optional. You send it and you say, I'm sorry, but I think that this word is incorrectly transcribed and it should be this. We will say, thank you very much if it's correct. We will present it to the editorial board, and if it's correct, we will correct it and indicate the credentials. I mean, give you the credit for being the finder of that particular transcription, or anything else, of course. So that's how this works. Are you tired? Otherwise, I would zoom out a little bit in It's really up to you. And if you want to discuss this freely, that's fine too. I have some general concluding remarks.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
General concluding remarks, and then we can put some questions and discuss together.
So that will be zooming out. So I told you about the teleological approach. Here started with the additions, and about this teleological approach. Sorry, I'll use this. We introduced notebooks for that, because as Almud Grésillon, famous theoretician of genetic criticism, said, Genesis is not the Genesis, the biblical Genesis, because biblical Genesis is very teleological. It progresses until God is satisfied. So the telos is God's satisfaction, basically. It doesn't proceed that way in creative processes. Usually it's much more sinuous. So this teleology was introduced by Ernst Haeckel to actually support Darwin's alternative to the story of Genesis. And he introduced this teleology, referring to vestigial organs in animals. Sorry for the ugly picture, but this is a snake, boa constrictor, which has these tiny hind legs here. They don't have any use, but they just indicate that these snakes descended from lizards. Yeah. So I think notes, even though they didn't make it into the final text, are like these vestigial organs. Yeah? You can also compare it to pentimenti in painting. Here, for instance, this is Velázquez. You see that horse? You see that he hesitated, and then, so it's called pentimenti. So in I mean, in English, yes. It's in art history they use it all the time. Yeah. So reading notes. Here, for instance, you have a very direct note. He's in Germany. He drinks some beer called Wallenstein beer, a glass of Wallenstein's lager, and it enters into the text in Malloy. Okay, it's funny, but it's absolutely not the most interesting note in this notebook. All the other notes are things that never made it into the final text, but they, from a poetical point of view, they are much more interesting. Yeah? So that's what I mean by this teleology. Or the drafts, as we have seen here, for instance, that final text of L'Innommable, where the physical object is also important. Theoretically, you can connect this to what Nelson Goodman has said. He makes a distinction between autographic and allographic art. And text, musical text or literary text, are usually considered to be allographic art. because you can reproduce them, because you have many versions. But of course, that is a very rough distinction. He calls it the unfakeable. So a painting cannot be faked. There's only one. But in our case, that notebook that you just saw is also an unfakeable document. There is only one. So I do think that in literature we can sometimes speak of orthographic art. Yeah? And then when we're dealing with the documents and genetic criticism, the same Pierre-Marc de Biassi has made a typology of all the documents that you can encounter, but there is one moment that is very important to him, and that is the bon à tirer, the moment the writer decides, okay, my work is ready to be published and presented to the world. But the way he presents this is as if it's a frozen moment. The text becomes frozen. Now, I don't know what you imagine when you read this metaphor, but I think of a lake or something, and the lake gets frozen. So you have a smooth surface. Let's say that's the smooth surface of the published text. But underneath that text, you have sometimes a whole mountain, an iceberg. That's the way I think of a frozen text. And it's that thing underneath that we try to uncover, of course. So usually this is called the text, and then that is the avant text. If we turn that into a more schematic presentation, you have a triangle, the text and the avant text, and underneath the surface, the genetic critics usually make a distinction between exogenesis and endogenesis, which is everything that is outside and everything that is inside the genesis. So the inside would be the drafts, and that would be the author's library, for instance, external source text that he uses. But of course, I think we need to add an epigenesis as well, which means all the things that, all the parts of things that are still part of the genesis, but after publication. So the continuation of the genesis after publication. Yeah? So you have these three aspects. Here, for instance, Beckett, you have a first edition of play where he says that the play at the end needs to be repeated exactly, like a da capo. Then he says it needs to be repeated, not exactly, in the second edition. And then he adds a whole note after he's seen the thing on stage, and then he changes the text. So the genesis goes on after publication. So the way I would like to present this, and I think I'll stop here, is a kind of triangular relationship rather than a binary relationship between before the text and the text. But you can see that the exogenesis still influences the epigenesis even after publication. Okay, we can go on, but that gives you an impression of a genetic edition and how to conceive of it, so to speak. Yeah? You're welcome.
Thank you very much indeed for this really inspiring lesson and exhaustive and about this huge and really interesting project. I have here so many questions. I think that it's better to write to you in the future, because this is a really complete project related to one of the most important authors of the 20th century, and you have really explained what is knowledge a site not only related to the text but also to all which is related to the author, and how to the difference between to represent a genesis of the text and to try to put text inside the context. So many questions, but first of all, I have to say that you have tried to make a connection between the genetic criticism and the tradition of the German philology, in my opinion, because when I see all the editions made from genetic criticism, critique génétique in France, I always see, especially from text in prose, simple representation of what we see directly on the manuscript, because they transcribe the text and they represent correction, deletions, insertions, but sometimes we have only a first transcription of the manuscript. On the contrary, coming from the German tradition, and our Italian tradition is really connected to the German one, when we study manuscript, we try to not only to transcribe the manuscript, but also to understand the relationship between what was written before and after, but these two elements may be put in a way just to make a comparison between them. You can compare things if they are discrete. I use this word in the mathematical assumption, because I can compare things only when they can be compared. And so you have made a solution of the differences between poetic words and words written in prose, because when you have a verse, the verse is your minimal unit, and sometimes I have seen many different projects based on the fact that they use the minimal unit as a verse. So the sentence is your minimal unit, and using the sentence as a minimal unit, you make something to solve the problem of a prose text, because a prose text sometimes is not, with the prose text is not that easy to make a comparison between text. And I think this is a really new way to study and to turn genetic criticism into something more, because it's not only the representation of text, but it's an interpretation of text. So I think it's really useful. But besides all my observation and question, I would like to stress that you are working with author under copyright. And so we yesterday saw a project with Italo Calvino, and they went on saying we are not allowed to publish text, we are not allowed to upload text, So they made a complete different project. And so how you, first of all, how many people are involved in your project, because it's a huge one, and how did you solve the problem of the dissemination of text, and how to cope with this problem, first of all?
It's a difficult topic, of course. We work on it, on and off, with about four people. Yeah. Well, on and off. So usually there's one technical person who's been on the project from the very start, and all the rest is coming in and going elsewhere as things go.
One people from the very beginning.
Yeah. 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 So one editor and one technical person, as a kind of, and of course the copyright problem was solved in, I don't know whether it's a good solution, but it was the only one that we could negotiate with the estate's lawyer. that is to make a contract that said, okay, you can put it all online, but behind a paywall. So people have to pay for this, and I think it's about 70 euros per year to see everything, yeah. Which has the advantage that it becomes always more interesting. So the longer you wait to pay your 70 euros, the better, because there will be more. Every year, that's the contract. Every year there will be a new module added, a new work added. So every year it becomes bigger.
And so you know that after 70 years, after Samuel Beckett's death, it will be open to everyone?
Yes. Yes.
So it's worthwhile making such a lot of stuff, because you know that in the future your project will be developed and shared.
Yeah.
And some universities probably may make a contract for their students.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah,
I don't know
exactly.
if we, at the University of
Yes.
Bologna, may pay at the university,
Yep.
so they can use the license given.
Yeah, all the students can work on it.
So you
for
have
next year.
several contracts with the university and not
Yep.
with single
Yes.
person, single
Yes.
individual.
Yes. We make use of the University of Antwerp press for that. So they take care of the registration of.
So with the press and not with the heirs.
Yes.
The
Yeah.
publishing house,
Yeah.
which is in charge of
Yeah. Payments.
the rights of
Yeah.
Beckett's,
Yeah.
and not with the heirs. Because
No. There's a difference.
I deal always with the heirs and publishing houses for
Yeah.
authors of 20th century, and so sometimes it's so difficult because
Yeah.
some heirs
Yeah.
own the rights of some works, and some publishing houses.
Yeah. We have to stop just before the bon à tirer. That's another disadvantage, because I can talk about epigenesis, but at this moment we can't actually present it. That's a big problem. But
I had another question. The title of your project is Samuel Beckett's Digital Manuscript. But when you talk about genesis of a work, novel, when you talk about the genesis, sometimes you deal not only with the manuscript but typewrites, or drafts with corrections, or prints, or several print. So sometimes we consider all this stuff to understand the genesis. But when you talk about epigenesis, you talk about something which is connected with the understanding of the making of some work. So you will oblige to change the title of your project, or somewhat.
yeah. Yes, we will. That's true.
Okay.
That's true. At this moment, we can't integrate the epigenesis. So that's why we also don't have the problem of the rights of the publishers, because we have Édition de Minuit to deal with, and Faber & Faber, and Grove Press in New York to deal with. And we don't have to do that now, because we stopped just short of the moment that they presented. Yeah. Yeah.
Beginning of the print. Even if
Yeah.
to understand the life of a single text,
Yeah.
is that really useful to study?
Absolutely.
Also
Absolutely.
genesis, but you have
Yeah.
done a great work
Yeah.
manuscript to life. So
It's good to have that restriction at this moment.
Just two questions. The first one is, did you choose the publishing house just because you had problems in managing the rights of the writings, or even because the publishing house gives you some more useful stuff in order to manage your process, your edition, and everything related to that? This is the first, and then
It's Actually, it's the idea behind it was we don't want to deal with that kind of stuff. I mean, it's really a lot of an administration to keep track of all the, the registration of all the names and all the institutions, and that's their job. So, and at the same time, it's also good to show, okay, this is not a website. This is an edition. It's published by this publishing house. I think it's something that's still not fully grasped, not just by the audience, but by our institutions. My institution, for instance, only counts the books that I publish, not the edition that I make. Although there's much more time that I spend on making these editions than the books. They consider it to be a website, but it's not a website, it's an edition. So it is important to have a publisher too, I think. I don't know, perhaps not. Perhaps we should just break with that tradition and say, look, we can do this ourselves because we host it ourselves. It's not the publisher that hosts it. The publisher is just a paywall somewhere saying, ho, 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 you have to pay. That's all they do. That's all they do.
Yes, because you know, in the digital humanities domain, there is a lot of discussion about the role of the publishing house in publishing digital edition. So, you know, as Elena Pierazzo, she reflects a lot about and on the fact that a publishing house can give you something more in order to create a digital edition, even if it's a website at the end, but website is just a medium in order to reach the information, neither different. And so the publishing house could have a role, or we have to think about new publishing houses that have also specific competencies in the digital humanities domain. So they are not just give you tools in order to create a website, but give you tool in order to create digital edition. So to have a completely different role as publishing houses. So. And another thing, just because it's just my job and my research interest, have you ever thought about the possibility to move to a semantic web environment or to add to XML TI approach more semantics or use some kind of data modeling at the conceptual level in order to enrich your results and to rethink about the text representation?
We've tried to do this for Joyce, where we use a different approach, more in terms of relational database, actually, where you have each page considered as just a piece of information that is connected. So I was talking about these connections. That takes it a step further, actually, and does not think in terms of old-fashioned, I don't think it's old-fashioned, but traditional editions, starting from the text, but as pieces of information that are related. And someone who comes, a PhD student who comes from IT, has an IT background, is working on that at this moment. And we have another student who is working on Joyce's library, and so they are working together to see if they can conceptualize it differently for Joyce. Not this way, but the Joycean way. I don't know what's the best. To me, if it works, it works. It's fine. Yes, a little bit, but I mean, we found our own creative solutions to overcome it, and it seems to work.
So it was not such a big problem.
No, I think, I think the whole discussion about XML or not is useful, but at the same time, I think we have to convince, in the first place, our own community of literary scholars to go for the digital and see it as something valuable. If we are divided amongst digital people to begin with, that doesn't help. So we have to say, look, we have a good standard, and 99% of us use it. If you want to start, use that. If you're very good at it, come up with something completely new. That's also fine. But we do have to be able to offer something to people who come, who begin with it. That's perhaps there are some questions.
I think that this idea of working with sentences is really interesting, but I'm wondering if maybe we just miss a little bit the context. And for example, if in version 3 of a work, the author changes sentence 1 and sentences 7 and 8 together in a single review step, it is possible to see that, or maybe it's not interesting for your kind of purposes, I don't know, because I think it's interesting in a genetic approach to have this possibility.
I fully see your point. To begin with, this is already, I'm all for more context. I see your point. It's a very good point, I think. In this case, I took a very short sentence to explain it. Usually the sentences are longer, so you have already more context. And if you compare it to any critical apparatus in paper form, in print form, you'll see that this is already much more context than what you get, because usually you only get the variant, not the things that are invariant. Here we give you both the variants and the invariants, the whole sentence in all the versions. But if you think as an editor of your project, you think, no, I need more context, you just say, let's take paragraphs, for instance, the whole paragraph. I give you the whole paragraph, but in all the versions. That's also a solution. Yeah, I fully see that. That's
if a sentence changes with another one together, you can't see that.
Depends on what kind of change it is. That's true. It is. You have a point that it takes arbitrarily, because we just decided for the whole project we're going for the sentences. It does create problems or situations where you don't have as much context as you might want. But the thing is, of course, that you have the survey. You can always go back immediately with one click to the original, and you can see what's happening on the page. So I guess, all right.
One last question. Sometimes at the very beginning of the life of a text, in the notebooks, and I think that your example on the note is really interesting. You can see something which is the beginning of a sentence or a scheme or a list of words, and these are not really making in a comparison with the sequent writings, but there is a connection, and sometimes the first drafts have a connection which is not really connected with the language or with the way of the specific writing of a sentence. And so how to represent this connection, or if you make a connection between two different things, different.
Yeah. I see sometimes it's hard to decide this is the first version. Very often you have version 000, you could say. We call these paralipomena because, I mean, that's the term that's been used in editorial theory for a long time. But originally it means the things that are left out, the things that are not part of a version. And they used to be just left out in editions. And in Beckett's case, it's very often he's writing, and it's going really well, and he has an idea, and he writes it down on the left-hand page. It's just a word, and then you see 2 pages further on, he uses that idea and turns it into a sentence. We use that paralipomenon and put it in front of the first sentence in the synoptic survey to make the connection.
You put it as an appendix.
No, just
The
yeah.
very origin.
Even though it's not a sentence, it's the origin. It's already in nuce. First thought. Yes.
But you can make a connection between the paralipomena because you think that the goal of the textual editor is to study a text and not only a process. Because I think that in your project, you have made a connection between the idea of a text as a datum and a text like as a process. Because in the genetic criticism, they consider not a text existing, but only the process of changing and making changes. Even though I think that in our tradition, the goal of the critical editor is to give a reader a text to read and to compare different versions of what is the first stage, the second one. Sometimes when you study the workflow of a text, you can really understand a single phase of all the steps. And even if it is really difficult, sometimes it is possible to see stages instead of a flow of a process. So, do you think it's much more similar to a process with this project, or a text process focused, or a text focused project? No.
I don't know. I would say it's process focused, because what I'm interested in is make the connections between all these things. Of course, before you can present something as a process, you need all the texts. So you have to present all the, I mean, perhaps you can do without. I don't know how the Calvino people do it. That would be just process without texts. That's good, but I do think it's always good to have the text very nearby, so that you can click on something and say, yes, but I don't understand what this means. I want the context, and then you can get the context. So that's what we try to provide as well. But of course, the focus is the process, I would say.
I think that is a mixture in your project between the idea of the text as only a process and our idea of, because we came from the analogic world, and so in front of the manuscript we had to decide if we wanted to print, because we had to make an analogic, a paper text. The first authors will, when we are seeing a manuscript, a draft, we can decide if we want to represent the very first draft, and our corrections will be represented in evolution, or you can write print the latest author's will, and so your apparatus will represent the genetic process. Sometimes it's useful to print the latest, or sometimes it's useful to print, to decide to put on text the first author's will, because sometimes the latest is the same of a typescript, and so, or the first drafts, and so it's not interesting to know the differences, and so we are deciding to print a genetic edition, and so we make a decision. So in Italian way of publishing first drafts and genetic avant text, we have a goal, and we have to decide, because we come from the analogic world, to establish a text, and we have a specific duty, which is to establish a text. So in this aspect, we are we have another perspective on text, and this is really different from the genetic criticism, because they consider the text as a flow, as a continuing process. But I think that in this approach, there is a mixture between text-focused editorial theory and process-focused editorial theory.
I see your point. I don't have that obligation. I don't have to produce one text, and I don't. But of course, we come so close to the bon à tirer that actually, if you take the synoptic sentence view and the last version is so close to the final text that you can consider it. And then, of course, you buy the book, and I mean, and you compare. Yeah, yeah.
No more questions? You maybe. We are just a little bit late, so thank you very much for your really inspiring lesson, and we will write to you. Do you track your readers with this project? Do you have the possibility to see how many people are seeing and how much time they spend on the specific drafts? No, it is not possible.
To some degree it's possible. How many is possible? But who or how many?
You are not interested in the scene.
Well, I have not spent time on it. I spend too much time making transcriptions, I'm afraid.
Okay.